Last night's Jimmy Kimmel Live turned into an explosive battleground when Samuel L. Jackson confronted the host over a racially insensitive joke, leading to the most shocking walkout in late-night television history that has viewers demanding accountability. The studio audience was settling in for what they expected to be another routine celebrity interview on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Samuel L. Jackson, promoting his latest action thriller, walked onto the stage with his characteristic confident stride, flashing that trademark smile that has captivated audiences for decades. The applause was thunderous as Jackson took his seat across from Kimmel, who seemed unusually animated, almost jittery, with an energy that seasoned viewers might have recognized as a warning sign. Sam, Kimmel began with his typical, casual familiarity, leaning back in his chair with that smirk that has become his signature. You know, I was watching some of your old movies this week, and I couldn't help but notice something. The audience chuckled expectantly, unaware they were about to witness television history unfold in the most uncomfortable way possible. Jackson, ever the professional, maintained his composure despite the subtle condescension in Kimmel's tone. "Oh yeah? What's that, Jimmy?" he responded, his voice carrying that unmistakable gravitas that commands respect in every room he enters. What happened next would send shockwaves through social media within minutes. Kimmel, apparently emboldened by what he perceived as comedic opportunity, launched into what he clearly thought was harmless banter. "Well, I noticed in a lot of your roles, you play these really intense, angry characters. And I was wondering, is that just natural talent, or do you have to really dig deep into some personal experiences to find that rage?" The studio fell silent. Even the crew members visible in the background seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Jackson's expression didn't change immediately, but those who knew him could see the subtle tightening around his eyes, the slight forward lean that indicated he was no longer in casual conversation mode. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you implying, Jimmy?" Jackson's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Kimmel, either oblivious to the danger or choosing to ignore it, pressed forward with what he seemed to believe was comedic gold. "Oh, come on, Sam. You know what I mean. The whole angry black man thing. It's kind of your brand, right? I mean, you've made a career out of it. That whole, 'I've had it with these snakes on this plane' energy." The audience's nervous laughter died quickly as they began to grasp the implications of what their host had just said. Jackson sat back in his chair, his hands folded, studying Kimmel with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds of live television that would be dissected frame by frame in the coming days. "My brand?" Jackson repeated slowly, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that movie audiences know precedes an explosion. "Jimmy, I think you might want to reconsider what you just said." But Kimmel, seemingly intoxicated by what he perceived as control of the situation, doubled down in the worst possible way. "Hey, I'm just saying you're really good at it. The whole intimidating thing. It works for you. I bet you don't even have to act. It probably just comes naturally, right?" The cameras caught everything. The collective intake of breath from the audience, the uncomfortable shuffling of the band members, and most importantly, the moment Samuel L. Jackson's professional mask finally slipped. His eyes flashed with a fury that made his most intense movie roles look tame by comparison. "Let me make something crystal clear to you, Jimmy," Jackson said, rising slightly in his chair, his voice carrying across the silent studio with the authority of a man who had spent decades commanding respect in Hollywood. "What you just said isn't comedy. It's ignorance wrapped in a punchline. And I won't sit here and let you reduce my 30-year career to some racist stereotype for your audience's entertainment." The tension in the studio was palpable now. Audience members were looking at each other uncertainly, unsure whether this was part of the show or something genuinely explosive happening before their eyes. The production crew behind the cameras were frantically communicating through headsets, clearly unprepared for this level of conflict. Kimmel, perhaps finally beginning to realize the gravity of his mistake, attempted damage control with all the finesse of a sledgehammer. "Whoa, whoa, Sam. I think you're taking this way too seriously. It's just jokes, man. Comedy. You know how this works." Jackson stood up fully now, his imposing 6'3" frame casting a shadow over the host's desk. "Just jokes?" he repeated, his voice rising for the first time. "Jimmy, you just spent the last 5 minutes trying to convince America that my success comes from playing into racial stereotypes, and you want to call that comedy?" The studio had gone completely silent except for the barely audible hum of the cameras still rolling, capturing every second of what was rapidly becoming the most uncomfortable moment in late-night television history. Even the usually chatty audience seemed to understand they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "Look, if you can't handle a little ribbing," Kimmel began, his voice taking on a defensive edge that only made the situation worse, "maybe late-night television isn't for you." That was the moment everything changed. Jackson's composure, which had been hanging by a thread, finally snapped completely, and the audience was about to witness exactly why Samuel L. Jackson had become one of Hollywood's most respected and feared actors. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Jackson's entire demeanor shifted from controlled professional to unleashed force of nature in a heartbeat. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of every character he'd ever played, every moment of respect he'd earned, and every ounce of dignity that Kimmel had just attempted to strip away. "Late-night television isn't for me." Jackson's laugh was cold, humorless, and sent chills through the studio. "Jimmy, I've been in this business since before you were even a thought in some network executive's head. I've worked with directors who actually understand respect, who know the difference between comedy and casual racism dressed up as entertainment." The audience sat frozen, many with their phones out, already recording what they instinctively knew would become viral content within hours. The band members had stopped pretending to look busy, openly staring at the unfolding drama with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed excitement. Kimmel, sweat now visible on his forehead, under the studio lights, made another catastrophic error in judgment. "Come on, Sam, you're being way too sensitive. This is how comedy works. We poke fun at everyone. It's equal opportunity humor." "Equal opportunity?" Jackson's voice rose to a level that made several audience members in the front row visibly flinch. "Jimmy, when's the last time you made jokes about white actors being naturally suited for their roles because of their race? When's the last time you suggested that Tom Hanks only gets cast because he's good at playing the earnest white guy?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the production assistants had stopped moving, creating an atmosphere so tense it felt like the air itself might crack. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, clearly scrambling for any response that might salvage the situation. That's different," Kimmel stammered, his usual confidence completely evaporated. "I mean, you have to admit, you do play a lot of similar characters." "Stop." Jackson's single word cut through the studio like a blade. "Just stop talking, before you make this worse for yourself." He took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence now completely dominating the space. "You want to know what's different, Jimmy? What's different is that I've spent 3 decades proving that I'm more than any single role, any single character, any single stereotype that people like you want to box me into." The cameras were capturing everything in excruciating detail. Kimmel's nervous swallowing, the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee mug, the beads of perspiration that had begun forming on his upper lip. This was no longer a talk show interview. This was a public reckoning. "I've been nominated for an Academy Award," Jackson continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've worked with Quentin Tarantino, Spike Lee, George Lucas. I've brought characters to life that have inspired millions of people around the world. And you want to reduce all of that to some cheap stereotype for a laugh? Members of the audience were now openly uncomfortable, some looking toward the exits, others pulling out their phones to text friends about what they were witnessing. The energy in the room had shifted completely from entertainment to something much more serious and potentially dangerous. Kimmel made one final, desperate attempt to regain control. "Look, Sam, I think we're both getting a little heated here. Maybe we should take a commercial break and—" "No." Jackson's voice boomed across the studio with such force that several people actually jumped in their seats. "We're not taking a break. We're not cutting to commercial. You started this conversation, Jimmy, and we're going to finish it right here, right now, in front of all these people and everyone watching at home." The producer visible in the wings was making frantic hand gestures, clearly trying to signal for a break, but Jackson's commanding presence had taken complete control of the situation. Even the camera operators seemed mesmerized, continuing to roll despite the obvious chaos behind the scenes. "You want to know what's really funny, Jimmy?" Jackson asked, his tone now carrying a dangerous edge that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "What's funny is that you think you can sit there, in your little bubble of privilege, and tell me what my career is about. You think you can define me, categorize me, reduce me to some marketing demographic that makes sense to your writers." Kimmel was now visibly shaking, his usual smug confidence replaced by something approaching genuine fear. The audience could sense the shift, the moment when entertainment had crossed over into something much more real and potentially explosive. "I've been patient with you, Jimmy," Jackson continued, moving even closer to the host's desk. "I've been professional. I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt. But what you've done here tonight isn't just disrespectful to me. It's disrespectful to every black actor who's ever had to fight against the exact kind of thinking you just put on display." The studio had become so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning was audible. Even the audience members who had been whispering had fallen completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. Jackson paused, looking directly into the camera with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the screen itself. "People watching at home need to understand what just happened here. This isn't about me being unable to take a joke. This is about a host who thinks it's acceptable to use racial stereotypes as comedy and then acts surprised when he gets called out for it." The weight of his words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the studio knew that what happened next would define not just the rest of the interview, but possibly the future of the show itself. Kimmel, desperate to salvage what remained of his reputation, made the worst possible decision he could have made in that moment. With his back against the wall and his career potentially hanging in the balance, he chose to double down rather than apologize. "You know what, Sam?" Kimmel said, his voice taking on a petulant edge that made him sound like a child caught in a lie. "I think you're making a mountain out of a molehill here. Comedy has always pushed boundaries. That's what makes it funny. If we can't joke about anything anymore, then what's the point?" The audience collectively gasped. Several people actually stood up from their seats, some heading toward the exits, others simply staring in disbelief at what they were witnessing. The few remaining loyal Kimmel fans in the crowd looked mortified, clearly understanding that their host had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. Jackson's reaction was immediate and volcanic. "A molehill?" he roared, his voice reverberating through the studio with such force that the microphones crackled. "Jimmy, you just spent 10 minutes trying to convince America that my success is based on playing racial stereotypes, and you think that's a molehill?" The producer in the wings was now frantically waving his arms, trying to get Kimmel's attention to signal for an emergency commercial break, but the host seemed completely oblivious to everything except his own defensiveness. "I never said anything about race," Kimmel protested weakly, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I was talking about your acting style. You're the one who brought race into this." The studio erupted, not in applause or laughter, but in a collective sound of shock and disapproval that seemed to come from every corner of the room. Audience members were shaking their heads, some openly expressing their disgust. The band members were exchanging incredulous looks, and even the camera operators seemed stunned by what they were capturing. Jackson stood perfectly still for a moment, his silence more terrifying than any outburst could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely lethal. "I brought race into this?" Jackson asked, each word precisely enunciated and dripping with barely contained fury. "Jimmy, you literally used the phrase angry black man not 5 minutes ago. You talked about it being my brand. You suggested it comes naturally to me because of who I am. And now you want to pretend you never mentioned race?" Kimmel's face had gone pale, beads of sweat now openly visible as the studio lights beat down on him. His usual composure had completely abandoned him, leaving behind a man who looked like he was drowning in his own mistakes. "That's not... I didn't mean it like that," Kimmel stammered, his voice barely audible now. "You're twisting my words." "I'm twisting your words?" Jackson's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Jimmy, there are cameras rolling. There are 300 people in this audience who heard exactly what you said. There are millions of people watching at home who witnessed every single word that came out of your mouth." The audience was now openly hostile toward Kimmel, with several people shouting comments of support for Jackson. The atmosphere in the studio had completely shifted from entertainment to something approaching a public tribunal, with Kimmel as the defendant and Jackson as both prosecutor and judge. "Let me ask you something, Jimmy," Jackson continued, moving even closer to the host's desk until he was looming over the smaller man. "How many black friends do you have? How many black writers work on your show? How many times have you had conversations about race that didn't involve making jokes about it?" Kimmel's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one highlighting the bubble of privilege and ignorance that had led to this moment. The audience waited for an answer that clearly wasn't coming. "That's what I thought," Jackson said with disgust. "You know what your problem is, Jimmy? You've been hiding behind that desk for so long, making jokes about people and situations you don't understand, that you've forgotten these are real human beings you're talking about." The studio had become a pressure cooker, with tension so thick it seemed almost visible. Several audience members were now openly filming with their phones, knowing they were witnessing television history in the making. The hashtag #ChaSamuelJacksonFicktional was already beginning to trend on social media as clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire. "I've given this industry everything," Jackson declared, his voice rising again as years of frustration poured out. "I've brought dignity to every role I've played. I've used my platform to inspire young actors, to break down barriers, to prove that talent has no color. And you want to reduce all of that to some cheap stereotype for a laugh track?" Kimmel made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Sam, please, let's just agree to disagree here. We're both passionate about what we do." "Passionate?" Jackson cut him off with a roar that made everyone in the studio freeze. "Jimmy, passion is what I bring to my craft every single day. Passion is spending months preparing for a role, learning every line, understanding every motivation. What you displayed tonight isn't passion. It's ignorance, arrogance, and disrespect wrapped up in a fake smile and a punchline." The moment had reached its breaking point. Jackson straightened to his full height, his presence now completely dominating not just Kimmel, but the entire studio. Every eye was on him as he prepared to deliver what everyone sensed would be his final statement. "You know what, Jimmy?" Jackson said, his voice now deadly calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than his earlier outbursts. "I've wasted enough of my time trying to educate someone who clearly doesn't want to learn. I've got better things to do than sit here and listen to you defend the indefensible." The audience held its collective breath as Jackson began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. The symbolic gesture sent a clear message that this interview was over, and it was ending on his terms, not Kimmel's. Sam. "Wait, please don't go," Kimmel pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation, as he realized the full magnitude of what was happening. "We can work this out. Let's just talk about this like adults." Jackson paused in his microphone removal, fixing Kimmel with a stare that could have melted steel. "Like adults?" he repeated slowly. "Jimmy, adults don't hide behind 'it's just comedy' when they say something ignorant. Adults don't double down on their mistakes when they're called out. Adults apologize when they're wrong." The studio was so quiet that the sound of Jackson's microphone hitting the desk echoed like a gunshot. Several audience members jumped at the noise, the sharp crack serving as an exclamation point to his words. The symbolic finality of the gesture sent ripples of excitement through the crowd, many of whom were now openly recording what they knew would be shared millions of times before the night was over. "You want to know what's really sad about all this, Jimmy?" Jackson asked, standing at his full imposing height while Kimmel seemed to shrink further into his chair. "It's that you had a chance tonight to have a real conversation with someone who's actually lived through the experiences you think are funny. Instead, you chose to treat me like a performing monkey for your audience's entertainment." Kimmel made one last pathetic attempt to salvage the situation. "That's not fair, Sam. I respect you. I've always respected your work. This whole thing has just been a misunderstanding." "Respect?" Jackson's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Jimmy, respect isn't something you claim to have. It's something you demonstrate through your actions. And your actions tonight have shown everyone exactly who you really are underneath that fake Hollywood smile." The audience began to stir, sensing that they were about to witness the climactic moment they would be talking about for years. Several people had moved to the edges of their seats, phones raised and ready to capture what happened next. Jackson turned to face the audience directly, addressing them with the commanding presence that had made him one of Hollywood's most respected figures. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to remember what you witnessed here tonight. This is what happens when ignorance meets accountability. This is what it looks like when someone who's used to getting away with casual racism finally gets called out for it." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. People were standing, cheering, some wiping away tears as they witnessed a moment of genuine courage and dignity in an industry that often lacks both. Kimmel sat frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of humiliation and defeat. The applause continued, for what felt like an eternity, each second driving home the complete reversal of power that had taken place. What had started as his show, his domain, had become Jackson's stage for a masterclass in grace under pressure. "I've been in this business for over 30 years, Jackson announced over the continuing applause, his voice carrying easily across the studio without amplification. "I've faced down racist directors, ignorant producers, and narrow-minded executives. I've fought for every role, every line, every moment of respect I've earned. And I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and let some talk show host tear down what I've built for cheap laughs." The standing ovation intensified, with several audience members now openly weeping at the raw emotion and dignity of Jackson's words. Even some of the crew members had stopped pretending to work, joining in the applause for a man who had just delivered one of the most powerful moments in television history. Jackson began walking toward the exit, his stride confident and purposeful. With each step, the applause grew louder, the audience seemingly unwilling to let this moment end. As he reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one final time to deliver his parting shot. "Jimmy, I hope you learned something tonight," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise with laser precision. "I hope everyone watching at home learned something. Respect isn't negotiable, dignity isn't a punchline, and accountability isn't optional." With that, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the stage and into television history, leaving behind a studio full of cheering fans and one thoroughly humiliated host. Kimmel sat alone at his desk, the weight of his mistakes crushing down on him as the Audience continued their thunderous approval of Jackson's exit. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of Kimmel's isolation and defeat. His usual closing remarks were nowhere to be found, his scripted jokes suddenly seeming pathetic and hollow in the wake of Jackson's authentic passion and dignity. As the applause finally began to die down, audience members started filing out, many of them already on their phones, sharing videos and reactions with the outside world. The hashtags were exploding across social media, with Yorin Samuel Jackson walkout and respect is not optional trending worldwide within minutes. The confrontation was over, but its impact was just beginning. Jackson had walked away with his dignity intact and his message delivered, while Kimmel was left to face the consequences of his actions in front of millions of viewers. The entertainment industry had witnessed a seismic shift, a moment when respect and professionalism triumphed over cheap laughs and casual ignorance. The incident would spark widespread discussion about accountability in entertainment, leading to significant changes in how late-night television approaches sensitive topics. Samuel L. Jackson had not just defended himself that night, he had struck a blow for dignity and respect that would resonate far beyond the walls of that Hollywood studio. In the end, one man's courage to stand up against ignorance had transformed what should have been a routine promotional appearance into a defining moment that reminded everyone watching that some things are more important than entertainment, and respect is never negotiable.